In the early hours of 21st January 1968, at the height of Cold War nuclear vigilance and amid the routine hazards of continuous deterrence operations, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber assigned to an airborne alert mission crashed near Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland, scattering nuclear weapons debris across Arctic ice and exposing the hidden risks embedded within everyday nuclear readiness. The aircraft, carrying 4 thermonuclear bombs, was part of a standing strategic air command posture intended to ensure a survivable retaliatory capability at all times, a posture that relied on constant flight, extreme environmental conditions, and the assumption that complex systems could be operated indefinitely without catastrophic failure. Shortly after takeoff, a fire broke out in the aircraft's cabin, triggered by a malfunction in the heating system and exacerbated by flammable materials stored on board. And despite attempts by the crew to control the blaze, the situation deteriorated rapidly as smoke filled the cockpit and critical systems failed. Recognizing that the aircraft could not be saved, the crew initiated emergency procedures, ejecting over the frozen expanse of Baffin Bay while the bomber continued on a doomed trajectory toward the Arctic ice near Thule, one of the most strategically important U.S. installations in the polar region. When the B-52 impacted the ice at high speed, the conventional explosives within the nuclear weapons detonated on contact, tearing the bombs apart and dispersing radioactive material, weapon components, and debris across a wide area of snow and ice. A violent end that narrowly avoided a nuclear yield, but created an environmental and political crisis whose implications would reverberate far beyond Greenland. The crash occurred in a context shaped by decades of Cold War escalation, in which nuclear weapons were routinely deployed in peacetime under conditions that prioritized readiness and credibility over the minimization of accident risk, and the Thule mission exemplified this logic, operating over remote regions precisely because of their strategic value in early warning and retaliation. Thule Air Base itself occupied a central place in U.S. nuclear strategy, hosting radar systems designed to detect Soviet missile launches over the polar route and serving as a key node in the architecture of early warning and deterrence, a role that made any incident in its vicinity acutely sensitive, both militarily and politically. The immediate aftermath of the crash unfolded under conditions of urgency and secrecy, as U.S. military authorities moved quickly to secure the site, assess the status of the weapons, and prevent escalation with allies whose territory and sovereignty were directly implicated. Danish authorities, responsible for Greenland's governance, were informed of the accident, but the full extent of the nuclear involvement was initially obscured by the same Cold War imperatives that had shaped responses to earlier accidents, reflecting a pattern in which reassurance and containment took precedence over transparency. Within hours, recovery teams were mobilized, confronting an environment of extreme cold, darkness, and physical danger as they worked to locate weapon components scattered across the ice, all while managing radioactive contamination and the risk of further explosive hazards. The Arctic setting magnified the complexity of the operation, as shifting ice, sub-zero temperatures, and limited daylight-constrained recovery efforts and introduced uncertainty about the long-term fate of unrecovered material. As with earlier nuclear accidents, the technical reality of the weapons diverged sharply from public narratives of control, revealing that while nuclear detonation had been avoided, the dispersal of plutonium and other materials represented a serious breach of safety that could not be fully undone. Internally, the Thule crash triggered intense scrutiny of airborne alert missions, particularly those involving nuclear weapons over Allied or semi-sovereign territory, as officials confronted the political consequences of accidents whose effects crossed national boundaries and challenged assurances given to host governments. Denmark's long-standing policy against nuclear weapons on its territory was thrown into question, as evidence emerged that U.S. nuclear weapons had been routinely flown over Greenland, despite official statements to the contrary, exposing a gap between declared policy and operational practice that strained alliance relations. This diplomatic dimension elevated the Thule crash beyond a technical failure, transforming it into a political incident that underscored the tension between alliance management and strategic necessity in the Cold War nuclear order. Within the United States, the accident reinforced growing unease about the cumulative risks of airborne alert operations, which had already been questioned after earlier near misses and accidents, and the loss of nuclear weapons in Greenland provided tangible evidence that the margin for error in such missions was dangerously thin. The Thule crash thus became part of a broader reckoning within Strategic Air Command and the Department of Defense, as planners weighed the deterrent value of continuous airborne presence against the reputational, environmental, and strategic costs of accidents that could no longer be plausibly dismissed as isolated anomalies. The recovery operation itself stretched over months, as thousands of tons of contaminated ice and snow were removed and transported for disposal, a process that highlighted both the scale of the contamination and the limits of remediation in such an environment, while leaving unresolved questions about whether all weapon components had been recovered. These uncertainties fed persistent speculation and concern, both locally and internationally, about the long-term environmental and health effects of the crash, effects that were difficult to measure and politically inconvenient to acknowledge fully. Strategically, the Thule incident intersected with a period of reassessment in U.S. nuclear posture, contributing to decisions that would soon curtail airborne alert missions and shift greater reliance onto ground and sea-based deterrent forces perceived as less prone to catastrophic accident. Yet even as operational changes followed, the underlying logic of deterrence remained intact, preserving a system in which extraordinary risks were accepted as the cost of preventing deliberate nuclear war. The Thule Air Base crash thus revealed the hidden vulnerabilities of Cold War nuclear operations, demonstrating how accidents in remote regions could generate consequences that rippled through alliance politics, environmental stewardship, and strategic doctrine, while remaining largely absent from public understanding at the time. It underscored that the dangers of the nuclear age were not confined to moments of confrontation, but were embedded in routine readiness, where technical failure, human error, and extreme conditions could converge with little warning. In this sense, the events of January 1968 marked not only a dramatic accident, but a critical moment in the evolving recognition that nuclear deterrence, far from being a purely rational and controllable system, rested on fragile foundations that could fracture under the weight of their own complexity, setting the stage for a deeper debate about safety, sovereignty, and the acceptable limits of risk in the Cold War world. In the days and weeks following the crash, the Thule incident evolved from an emergency response into a sustained multinational operation that exposed the logistical, political, and strategic consequences of nuclear accidents conducted under the umbrella of secrecy, as the United States confronted the reality that the containment of radioactive debris was inseparable from the management of alliance trust. Recovery teams, drawn from U.S. military units and specialized technical groups, worked under extreme Arctic conditions to locate, collect, and transport contaminated ice and weapon fragments, a task complicated by drifting sea ice, sub-zero temperatures, and prolonged darkness that limited visibility and increased the risk of exposure. the scope of the cleanup rapidly expanded as surveys revealed that debris fields extended far beyond initial estimates, forcing planners to acknowledge that complete recovery might be impossible and that remediation would be defined by practical limits rather than total restoration. These operational challenges unfolded alongside diplomatic strain, as Danish officials pressed for clarity regarding the presence of nuclear weapons and the extent of contamination, confronting a discrepancy between Denmark's public policy of prohibiting nuclear weapons on its territory and the operational realities of U.S. deterrence missions that had quietly relied on Greenland as a strategic platform. The resulting tension revealed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Cold War alliances, in which security commitments depended on practices that could not always be reconciled with host nation political constraints, and in which secrecy functioned as a lubricant that allowed incompatible positions to coexist until an accident made them visible. Internal communications within the U.S. government reflected acute awareness of this contradiction, as officials sought to reassure Danish authorities without disclosing details that could provoke domestic backlash or invite scrutiny of broader nuclear practices, a balancing act that prioritized alliance stability over full transparency. The environmental dimension of the Thule crash added further complexity, as the dispersal of plutonium across ice and water raised concerns about long-term contamination pathways that were poorly understood and difficult to monitor, particularly in an Arctic ecosystem where seasonal change could redistribute material over wide areas. While official assessments emphasized that the absence of a nuclear yield had prevented catastrophic damage, they also acknowledged privately that conventional explosive detonation had aerosolized radioactive material in ways that could not be fully reversed, ensuring that the incident would leave a lasting imprint even after visible debris was removed. These realities challenged prevailing assumptions that nuclear accidents could be contained through technical response alone, highlighting the limits of control once weapons were deployed outside secure facilities and exposed to uncontrolled environments. Politically, the crash intensified scrutiny of airborne alert missions, especially those conducted over allied or semi-sovereign territories, as policymakers recognized that accidents in such contexts carried costs far beyond immediate operational loss, threatening alliance cohesion and public legitimacy. Within Strategic Air Command, the Thule incident reinforced arguments that the cumulative risk of continuous airborne operations had reached an unacceptable level, adding weight to internal debates already influenced by earlier accidents and near misses. These debates unfolded at a moment when technological and strategic alternatives were becoming more viable, including hardened missile silos and ballistic missile submarines that promise survivability without constant flight, shifting the calculus of deterrence toward systems perceived as less accident-prone. The eventual decision to terminate routine airborne alert missions later in 1968 reflected this reassessment, marking a significant operational change shaped in part by the lessons of Thule, even as officials avoided publicly linking the decision to the crash. For Denmark, the incident left a legacy of unresolved questions about sovereignty, environmental responsibility, and the limits of alliance discretion, prompting domestic debate that would surface intermittently in subsequent years as details of the accident emerged. The episode underscored how smaller states hosting strategic infrastructure bore disproportionate risk in the nuclear order, exposed to hazards generated by superpower competition without full control over the practices that produced them. Analytically, the Thule crash demonstrated that nuclear deterrence functioned within a web of political relationships that could be strained or damaged by accidents, revealing that the credibility of alliances depended not only on shared threat perception, but on the management of risk and information. The secrecy that initially shielded the incident from public view proved effective in the short term, yet it also planted the seeds of later mistrust, as partial disclosures and declassified material fueled suspicion that the true extent of danger had been minimized. The recovery operation itself became a symbol of the limits of remediation, as vast quantities of contaminated material were removed while uncertainty persisted about what remained beneath the ice, a physical manifestation of the incomplete control that characterized nuclear risk management. As months passed, the immediate crisis gave way to institutional learning, with safety protocols reviewed, emergency response procedures refined, and assumptions about operational risk quietly adjusted, even as the fundamental reliance on nuclear deterrence remained unchanged. The Thule incident thus entered Cold War history not as a public turning point, but as a catalyst for incremental change, influencing decisions and practices within closed circles while leaving official narratives of stability largely intact. It revealed that the most serious consequences of nuclear accidents often unfolded over time, through shifts in policy and perception, rather than through dramatic immediate outcomes, and that the management of such accidents required coordination across military, scientific, and diplomatic domains. In this sense, Thule illuminated the interconnected nature of nuclear risk, demonstrating that technical failure could cascade into political and strategic effects that extended far beyond the crash site itself, challenging the assumption that accidents were merely operational anomalies rather than systemic warnings. As the Cold War continued, the memory of Thule persisted within institutional consciousness as evidence that deterrence imposed hidden costs on allies and environments, costs that were rarely acknowledged openly, but that shaped the boundaries of acceptable practice. The crash thus stands as a reminder that the nuclear order was sustained through a continual process of adjustment and compromise, in which accidents forced recognition of vulnerability, even as they failed to overturn the underlying logic of deterrence that had made such accidents possible in the first place. As the immediate operational and diplomatic fallout of the Thule crash subsided, its deeper significance emerged through the structural changes it accelerated within Cold War nuclear posture, revealing how accidents functioned as catalysts for adaptation even when they were publicly minimized, and how the management of nuclear risk depended on lessons learned quietly rather than declarations made openly. The termination of routine airborne alert missions later in 1968 marked a decisive shift away from a practice that had symbolized constant readiness, reflecting an institutional acknowledgement that the cumulative dangers of continuous flight with live nuclear weapons outweighed its deterrent value in an era when alternative systems could provide survivability without comparable accident risk. This shift did not represent a retreat from deterrence, but a reconfiguration of its mechanisms, as emphasis moved toward hardened missile silos, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and improved early warning systems that reduced reliance on vulnerable, airborne platforms. The Thule incident thus intersected with broader technological and strategic trends, reinforcing a transition already underway while providing concrete evidence that bolstered arguments for change. Within alliance politics, the crash left a residue of caution as host nations hosting strategic assets became more attentive to the risks they were bearing and more sensitive to discrepancies between declared policy and operational reality, a dynamic that complicated future negotiations over basing, overflight, and nuclear sharing. Denmark's experience highlighted the asymmetry inherent in Cold War alliances, where smaller states accepted exposure to extraordinary hazards in exchange for security guarantees, often without full visibility into the practices that generated those hazards. The gradual disclosure of information about Thule in subsequent years amplified this tension. As revelations about the extent of nuclear involvement fueled domestic debate, and skepticism about the adequacy of consultation and consent, reinforcing demands for greater transparency, even as strategic imperatives continued to constrain it. Environmentally, the accident underscored the persistence of nuclear legacies, as concerns about residual contamination and long-term health effects lingered despite official assurances, illustrating how the consequences of nuclear accidents extended beyond immediate crisis management into prolonged uncertainty. These environmental dimensions were difficult to quantify and politically inconvenient, ensuring that they remained marginal in strategic discourse, even as they shaped local experience and perception. Analytically, Thule contributed to a growing recognition that nuclear safety could not be treated as a purely technical problem, but was inseparable from organizational culture, alliance relations, and political accountability, a recognition that influenced later approaches to nuclear stewardship and crisis management. This recognition did not eliminate risk, but it reframed it, encouraging a more systemic understanding of how accidents occurred and how their effects propagated through interconnected domains. The incident also reinforced the role of secrecy as both a stabilizing and destabilizing force, capable of preventing immediate panic and diplomatic rupture, while undermining trust over time as suppressed information surfaced. This dual character of secrecy was emblematic of the Cold War nuclear order, which relied on controlled narratives to sustain deterrence, even as it managed dangers that could not be fully controlled. For Strategic Air Command and related institutions, Thule joined earlier accidents as evidence that organizational learning was essential to survival, prompting revisions to training, storage, and emergency procedures that sought to reduce the likelihood and impact of future incidents without fundamentally altering strategic objectives. These revisions reflected a pragmatic acceptance that accidents were not anomalies, but predictable byproducts of operating complex systems under constant pressure, and that resilience depended on anticipation rather than denial. As the Cold War progressed, the memory of Thule informed internal risk assessments and reinforced the importance of redundancy and restraint. Even as public discourse continued to frame nuclear deterrence in terms of balance and stability rather than hazard and vulnerability. The crash thus illustrates how Cold War history unfolded on parallel tracks, with public narratives emphasizing control and deterrence, and internal processes grappling with uncertainty and failure. In this context, Thule stands as a pivotal episode that exposed the hidden costs of nuclear readiness, demonstrating that the prevention of deliberate war depended on practices that carried their own dangers, and that managing these dangers required continual adaptation rather than static solutions. The incident's legacy lies in the way it forced institutions to confront the limits of their own control, revealing that nuclear deterrence was sustained not by the absence of failure, but by the capacity to absorb shocks and learn from near disaster. By bringing nuclear weapons literally into the ice and soil of an Allied territory, the Thule crash made visible the physical reality of nuclear risk, challenging abstractions that framed deterrence as a purely strategic calculus. Its significance endures as a reminder that the Cold War's stability was not a given, but a contingent outcome shaped by countless decisions, adjustments, and narrow escapes, many of which remained hidden from public view. The Thule Air Base crash thus occupies a critical place in the history of nuclear deterrence, not as a moment of confrontation, but as an episode that revealed the fragility of systems designed to prevent war and the extent to which peace depended on managing the unintended consequences of readiness itself. As the Thule crash receded from immediate policy debate and entered the realm of institutional memory, Its enduring impact became evident in how it reshaped assumptions about acceptable risk within the Cold War nuclear system, reinforcing a recognition that deterrence depended as much on preventing internal failure as on deterring external attack. The incident demonstrated that nuclear weapons, once deployed beyond tightly controlled environments, introduced layers of vulnerability that could not be fully mitigated through technical safeguards alone, compelling organizations to confront the reality that accidents were not improbable anomalies, but foreseeable outcomes of operating complex systems under extreme conditions. Within U.S. defense planning, this recognition encouraged a more explicit incorporation of accident scenarios into risk assessment, shaping how planners evaluated the trade-offs between operational posture and safety, even as strategic imperatives continued to limit the scope of reform. The Thule experience reinforced the value of diversification within the nuclear triad, as reliance on multiple delivery systems was increasingly seen not only as a hedge against enemy action, but as a means of reducing exposure to any single category of failure, whether technical, human, or environmental. This perspective aligned with broader Cold War trends that emphasized redundancy and survivability, yet Thule added a distinct dimension by highlighting the political and environmental consequences of accidents that could not be confined to military institutions. For Allied governments, the incident sharpened awareness that participation in nuclear deterrence carried implicit risks that extended beyond strategic calculations, prompting more cautious engagement with basing arrangements and overflight permissions, and reinforcing demands for consultation even when secrecy constrained disclosure. Denmark's experience served as a reference point in these discussions, illustrating how the exposure of hidden practices could strain alliance relationships long after an accident had passed, and underscoring the importance of trust in sustaining cooperative security arrangements. The gradual release of information about Thule in later years further complicated this dynamic, as retrospective revelations challenged earlier assurances and fueled skepticism about official narratives, highlighting the long-term costs of managing nuclear risk through opacity. Environmentally, the crash left a legacy that resisted closure, as questions about residual contamination and health effects persisted despite cleanup efforts, reflecting the difficulty of conclusively resolving the consequences of nuclear accidents in remote and fragile ecosystems. These unresolved aspects reinforced a broader understanding that nuclear incidents produced enduring uncertainty, extending their impact far beyond the moment of crisis and complicating efforts to draw clear boundaries around responsibility and remediation. Analytically, Thule reinforced the argument that nuclear safety was inseparable from governance, as decisions about deployment, secrecy, and alliance management directly shaped the distribution of risk and the capacity to respond when failures occurred. The incident illustrated that the nuclear order functioned through negotiated compromises between competing priorities, in which safety, credibility, and political feasibility were balanced imperfectly and recalibrated in response to shocks. Within military culture, the crash underscored the burden placed on individuals operating within deterrence systems, whose adherence to procedure and discipline constituted a final line of defense against catastrophe, even as systemic pressures and environmental extremes limited their ability to control outcomes. This human dimension added another layer to understanding nuclear risk, revealing that deterrence relied not only on machines and doctrines, but on the performance of personnel under conditions of uncertainty and stress. As Cold War tensions fluctuated in subsequent years, the lessons of Thule remained embedded within professional consciousness, informing training, emergency planning, and safety engineering, even as they remained largely invisible to the public narratives that framed nuclear deterrence as stable and controlled. The crash thus exemplifies how the Cold War was sustained through a continuous process of adaptation, in which accidents served as feedback mechanisms that prompted adjustment without fundamentally altering the underlying logic of nuclear competition. In this sense, Thule represents a moment when the hidden costs of deterrence briefly surfaced, forcing recognition of vulnerability and compelling incremental change, while leaving intact the strategic assumptions that had made such accidents possible. The incident's significance lies in its demonstration that stability was not a static achievement but a fragile equilibrium maintained through constant vigilance and learning, and that the absence of catastrophe often depended on the capacity to absorb and respond to failure, rather than on the elimination of risk itself. As historians and analysts examine the Cold War nuclear record, Thule stands as evidence that the era's most consequential dynamics unfolded not only in crises of confrontation, but in the quiet management of danger, where accidents tested the resilience of systems designed to prevent war. The crash thus occupies a central place in understanding the lived reality of deterrence, revealing that peace in the nuclear age was preserved not solely by strategic calculation, but by the continual negotiation of risk across technical, political, and environmental domains. As the long-term consequences of the Thule Air Base crash continued to surface through declassification, investigation, and retrospective analysis, the episode increasingly came to be understood as a turning point in how nuclear accidents were conceptualized within Cold War governance, revealing not only technical vulnerability, but the political fragility of deterrence systems that depended on secrecy and trust. The gradual release of documents in subsequent decades confirmed that while no nuclear detonation occurred, complete recovery of weapon components was never definitively achieved, leaving unresolved questions about the fate of fissile material and reinforcing public concern that official assurances had understated the scope of the incident. These revelations strained confidence in earlier narratives and highlighted the difficulty of reconciling national security secrecy with democratic accountability, particularly when the risks borne by civilian populations and allied territories had been minimized or obscured. For Denmark, the continued emergence of new information reopened debates about sovereignty and consent, as it became clear that nuclear practices conducted in Greenland had exceeded what had been publicly acknowledged, underscoring how Cold War alliances often relied on tacit understandings that could not withstand exposure. This erosion of trust illustrated a broader pattern in which the concealment of nuclear risk, while stabilizing in the short term, generated long-term political costs that complicated alliance cohesion and public legitimacy. Within the United States, retrospective scrutiny of Thule contributed to a more explicit acknowledgement among experts that accidental nuclear war had been a real and persistent danger, shaping academic and policy discourse that increasingly emphasized the role of organizational failure, human error, and complex system interaction in producing near catastrophe. This shift in understanding did not overturn deterrence doctrine, but it reframed debates about nuclear safety, moving them beyond technical fixes toward broader questions of governance, oversight, and acceptable risk. The Thule crash thus became a reference point in discussions about the limits of control in nuclear systems, illustrating how even well-resourced and technologically advanced institutions could be confronted with failure modes they neither anticipated nor fully managed. Environmentally, the lingering uncertainty surrounding contamination served as a reminder that nuclear accidents imposed costs that extended across generations, complicating efforts to define closure and reinforcing skepticism toward claims that such incidents could be fully contained or resolved. Analytically, the episode strengthened arguments that the Cold War nuclear order was sustained through a precarious balance of power, procedure, and fortune, rather than through deterministic stability, challenging interpretations that portrayed deterrence as a self-correcting or inherently safe system. As more information entered the public record, Thule came to symbolize the hidden dimension of Cold War risk, standing alongside other near misses as evidence that the survival of the nuclear age depended on more than strategic intent, relying instead on layers of contingency that could not be guaranteed. The crash underscored that the most dangerous moments of the Cold War were often those least visible at the time, embedded in routine operations whose failure threatened consequences far beyond their immediate context. This recognition has influenced contemporary assessments of nuclear risk, informing efforts to improve transparency, safety culture, and international norms, even as nuclear weapons remain central to global security structures. The Thule incident thus serves as a historical case study in the unintended consequences of deterrence, revealing how systems designed to prevent war could generate risks that transcended borders and challenge the political foundations of alliance-based security. Its enduring significance lies in demonstrating that nuclear stability was never solely a matter of adversary restraint, but depended equally on the internal capacity of states to manage complex technologies responsibly and to confront the limits of secrecy when accidents occurred. As Cold War history is reassessed through the lens of accident and near miss, Thule occupies a critical position, illustrating how peace was maintained not only through balance and deterrence, but through continuous, often unseen efforts to prevent catastrophe arising from within, the very systems meant to ensure security. In this final analysis, the Thule Air Base crash reveals that the nuclear age was characterized by an ongoing negotiation with danger, one in which the absence of disaster was the product of constant adjustment and learning rather than inherent safety, and where the line between deterrence and disaster remained perilously thin beneath the surface of apparent stability. In its final historical balance, the Thule Air Base crash of 1968 stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that the Cold War nuclear order was sustained not by flawless control or rational certainty, but by a fragile equilibrium in which catastrophe was repeatedly avoided through a combination of restraint, adaptation, and chance, revealing that the most severe dangers of the era often arose from within the mechanisms of deterrence themselves rather than from deliberate confrontation. The dispersal of nuclear weapons across Arctic ice exposed the physical reality of nuclear risk in a way that strategic abstractions could not obscure, showing that readiness carried tangible consequences for Allied territory, the environment, and political legitimacy, consequences that could not be fully contained by secrecy or technical response. The incident forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of their own control, demonstrating that even the most disciplined organizations operating the most advanced systems were vulnerable to cascading failure under extreme conditions, and that the prevention of disaster depended on layers of mitigation whose effectiveness could never be guaranteed. Thule's legacy lies in the quiet changes it accelerated, the termination of airborne alert missions, the refinement of safety and recovery procedures, and the growing recognition that nuclear deterrence required constant recalibration rather than static confidence, changes that unfolded without public acknowledgement, yet reshaped the practical operation of nuclear forces. Politically, the crash illuminated the asymmetries of Cold War alliances, in which smaller states absorbed disproportionate risk while lacking full visibility into the practices that generated it, revealing how deterrence relied on managed ambiguity and trust that could be undermined when accidents exposed hidden realities. Environmentally, the persistence of uncertainty surrounding contamination underscored that nuclear accidents produced consequences extending far beyond the moment of crisis, challenging the notion that such events could be neatly resolved and reinforcing skepticism toward assurances of containment. Analytically, Thule compels a reassessment of Cold War stability, shifting focus from dramatic confrontations to the everyday management of hazard embedded in routine operations, and highlighting that the avoidance of nuclear war depended as much on organizational learning and accident prevention as on diplomacy or military balance. The incident demonstrates that deterrence was not a condition of safety, but a process of continuous risk negotiation, one in which errors, failures, and near misses were integral to the system rather than aberrations outside it. As later decades brought partial transparency and historical scrutiny, Thule emerged as evidence that the Cold War's apparent stability masked persistent vulnerability, and that peace was maintained through a series of narrow margins rather than through inherent systemic reliability. In this sense, the crash stands as a reminder that the nuclear age was shaped by forces often invisible to public view, where the greatest threats lay not only in adversary intent, but in the complex interaction of technology, environment, and human judgment. The Thule Air Base crash thus occupies a critical place in Cold War history, revealing how close deterrence came to failure without external provocation, and underscoring that the survival of the era depended on the capacity to recognize vulnerability and adapt before disaster occurred. A lesson whose relevance extends beyond the Cold War itself and into any future defined by weapons whose destructive power exceeds the margin for error.